Good morning. So here we are continuing the chapter about Flake, the first and last cockerel. Our neighbour and friend, Manuel T, first heard about the unwanted cockerel when Stephen and I appeared at the door of his adega. Signor T had been a widower for many years, but following the passing of his wife, there had remained a link to her family home through his relationship with his father-in-law. And after some years, it was in that house that we now lived. Manuel T was not a greatly travelled man, but when it came to English people, he thought he knew their character reasonably well. The amount of British people who were drawn to potato were inordinately large in comparison with the resident population. But instead of this being a thing of concern for the Portuguese man, and the villagers in general, people from England who settled in his village were welcomed warmly. Not to say, however, that Manuel T was under any illusion that the foreign residents in his village were all the same, and in fact the present two men were by far more different than any others he knew or had known. Even between Stephen and me, our different personalities were marked. From the very first meetings in our new place of residence, during those very first weeks and months, everyone who met us noted that one doesn't say a lot and the other one laughs at everything you say. In time, Stephen spoke more and won over any of those who had interpreted his quietness as a certain snobbishness. The improvement in my ability to really understand my neighbours and not just invent what they had said led to more conversation. And with words to hide embarrassing silences, the laughing did not disappear, but it certainly became less nervous in its tone and origin. Due to the above, it had been me, more than Stephen, who had been able to engage in the most conversation with Manuel T. But it had appeared to be Stephen to whom our neighbour had a greater connection. The Portuguese man was not sexually attracted to men. Of course he wasn't. But my husband was undeniably handsome, and with a broad chest and shoulders, it was not surprising if he was the one people found themselves first attracted to. However, it was not only his appearance. He was very charismatic, which once you had seen past the silence, came to light even when his language skills were rudimentary. Stephen had an enthusiasm for life, and was able to animate a room with his playfulness and energy. Opposites do indeed sometimes attract, and that was proven by me being many of the things Stephen was not. The physical contrast was immediately obvious, and it took only a little time to understand that whereas Stephen was like river rapids that provided excitement and could not fail to grip your attention, I was that first trickle of water, tentatively finding its way forward, embarrassed almost by its existence in the scheme of creating something bigger. But enough of this, and back to our cockerel. At the time we were in Manel's adega, discussing the bird we did not want, the future had yet to be written. But the years would reveal changes in the relationship between the three of us. As the visits I paid to Manuel T with Melina, but without Stephen, became the rule rather than the exception. Through building lives for ourselves in Portugal, the number of people we knew grew, whilst the amount of time we had to sit in the cool adega of a friend, explore places with Melina, watch the setting sun, or study Portuguese together lessened. Stephen's passion for music, which had burned within him from his earliest memories, had struggled to stay alight in the years preceding his move to Portugal. But away from the noise and stresses of London, nestled in the beautiful wooded mountains of what for him was a new country, he found inspiration and new outlets for his musical talent. New connections needed to be nurtured, and that demanded more of Stephen's time. The musician became absorbed, sometimes for lengthy periods, in the world that took him away from me. And although I loved music, was proud of what I saw my partner achieving, and happy about the recognition he received because of it, Stephen lived in a musical world that I was not part of. For me, it was writing to friends and keeping a rough journal, which would eventually develop into something greater that filled some of the gap created by the absence of city life. As I recorded the changes going on with my family and our surroundings, I was persuaded to turn those notes into a book. And later, I would use the tales that I'd been told by friends and neighbours in our village, and use my imagination too, to create other stories. The relaxed, joking manner that Stephen had, the excitement he found impossible to mask when he was happy or enthusiastic, and the talent which brought so much joy to people had a reverse side. Doubtless it was a musician's creative genius which demanded a price and dictated how he subconsciously parcelled up his time. And if anyone knew what that cost was to him himself, it was me. As I saw the man I loved judging himself equally as harshly as he would others. Stephen was capable of demonstrating great patience, but when he was preoccupied, it took only a split second for the people around him to become distractions, which he found difficult to pencil time in for. It was my slow meander, as contrasted with Stephen's splash, which accounted for one of the reasons I increasingly shared a glass of wine with Manuel T in his adega more often than Stephen. It was not due to some benevolent gesture I was making, but because Manel had become a good friend. During the afternoons that the two of us, three including Melina, were together, there were times when the elderly Portuguese man was not in the brightest of moods, and I would sit there with my mind wandering to anywhere other than where I actually was. On other occasions, the hours with Manel were used by me to hone conversation skills. But the most rewarding afternoons with my friend were those times when Manel really piqued my interest through some glimpse of bygone days, such as the arrival of television in the village. The story about the parish church having the only television and charging parishioners admission into the hall to watch the new technology had reminded me of tales about an England that had been slipping further into the past all my life. An era when materially people had little, but were somehow all the richer. Anyway, after acquiring the cockerel we did not want, it seemed quite appropriate for Stephen and me to approach Manel for a solution. It was not unusual for him to comment on the fact that in place of the voices of men and women working in fields around the village potato, there were now cries of goats, dogs and chickens. So with this in mind, Stephen and I were pretty sure he would know who might take our unwanted bird off our hands. "Boa tarde, senhor," we called out as we approached the Portuguese man's house. "Oh, boa tarde, o que se passa?" Manel reciprocated the good afternoon and asked what we were up to. Once we'd entered the cool wine cellar beneath Manel's house and sat down alongside and opposite him, we were offered a glass of red wine. The three of us chatted, and the topic of the unwanted bird surfaced, alongside a possible solution in the shape of Manuel J, Manuel T's brother-in-law. We returned home, leaving the matter with our friend. It was later that night that Manuel J and one of his sons arrived at our house with a dozen eggs. After seeing the unwanted guest and agreeing to take it, that's the cockerel I'm talking about, A time was set for the following evening at which the bird was to be collected. Manel J had originally put forward a later time than early evening to pick up the cockerel, and in hindsight, Stephen and I would have been well advised to have heeded his suggestion. Yet fearing we would end up fumbling around in the dark, Stephen and I had ignored the more experienced man's proffered idea to wait until the light was fading, a time when chickens were winding down for the night. In our defence, though, we'd been given a false idea of chicken behaviour by our resident hen Trilby. Whereas she used to walk up to us quite happily and even enjoyed hopping on our shoulders and being cradled in Stephen's arms, whatever the time of day. We had failed to appreciate that we had not gained that confidence in the cockerel. The start of the great cockerel caper began when Stephen stepped into the area which housed the friendly fowl. Trilby approached the man and received the usual petting, but the focus of the evening darted past its potential captor with surprising swiftness, and as Stephen moved towards it, the bird began darting first this way and then that. After a couple of minutes of deftly avoiding the clutches of one adversary, I joined in the attempted capture, and the situation took a turn for the worse. After being cornered, the bird flapped his wings and got enough lift to carry him over the wall which separated our property from that of another British couple who had a holiday home there. As was generally the case, the house that time was unoccupied. It was situated a little below our place, and Stephen's attempt to gain the cockerel had made it panic and lifted it. Oh, I've got to stop here. I'm starting that part again. I'm not doing the recording again because I've already tried this about 3 or 4 times and made mistakes. So I'm just going to go back to the part of a couple of minutes of deftly avoiding the clutches of one adversary. I joined in the attempted capture, and the situation took a turn for the worse. After being cornered, the bird flapped its wings and got enough lift to carry him over the wall which separated our property from that of another British couple's holiday home. As was generally the case, the house that occupied a situation a little below mine and Stephen's home was empty at that time. The cockerel paid it a visit, and we had no choice but to climb over the wall in pursuit. Being owned by Brits, luck had it that the neighbour's garden was an exception to many of the places in the area and had a fence around it. Nevertheless, it was uncertain how long Flake, as the cockerel had become known, would remain confined by the low wire barrier to his freedom. Manel J's wife and 2 grandchildren had accompanied him this time, and feeling a little embarrassed for her 2 foreign neighbours, she suggested that it might be a better idea if they leave and return a little later. Yet Stephen and I would not hear of it, and we were determined not to let the bird get the better of us. If the minutes had been awkward for us grown-ups, then for the young girl and boy who had their heads peeping over the wall at us, the scene below was highly amusing. Manel called out to us, suggesting the idea that we use a cover. No, it wasn't because the hour had advanced so much that everyone was past their bedtime, but it was to throw over the bird and stop it flying up. Having previously ignored our neighbour's advice about the time of day to remove the bird, and at that moment living with the consequences, this time his counsel was heeded. There was not a blanket easily available, but a large towel hung over the washing line, and Manel J passed this over the wall. The animal was at that time strutting around only a short distance from where I had been handed the item, But once Flake caught sight of this further activity, he ran and flapped once more, though his movements at this point were not so much haphazard as carefully choreographed to make the reactions of his human pursuers look clumsy. The bird expertly manoeuvred himself down the flight of outdoor stairs, while we were lucky not to have tumbled down them. When all three of us were at the bottom, I pounced forward with the towel, and as the cockerel gave a mocking cry before ascending the steps once more, I landed heavily on knees and elbows. Stephen took charge of the capture, while I tried to predict and block the bird's possible escape routes. But no one was taking bets on who or what would be the victor. A couple more failed attempts with the towel were made before the cover reached its target. The odds had fallen in our favour after we had managed to block the flight path of the creature, and it flapped only a little under the weight of the material holding it down. As the sun set over the village of Potato, Manel J went home with his family and the new addition. Stephen and I cleaned up grazed hands and muddied knees. Yet despite the trouble the cockerel had caused, he was already being missed. In my mind, there had been something right about seeing the little chap fly up to his roost at dusk. But fate had it that we'd not seen the last of Flake the cockerel. Well, sorry for the stuttering over some of that, but I've made quite a few notes on these pages where I've changed again the third into the first person and actually just rewritten some of it because it sounded pretty bad after all these years. So sorry for that. And tomorrow's chapter is Coburn, Cockerel number 2. Okay, at